Let me start by saying that I don't usually share stuff online, but what happened to me and my coworkers over the past month feels like something I need to get off my chest. I work in a small company, a typical 9 to 5 setup with cubicles, coffee breaks, and awkward small talk. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills, and most of the time, it's a pretty laid-back environment. About a month ago, we got a new hire named Jake. He was in his early 20s, fresh out of college, and eager to impress. You know the type, always offering to help, staying late to finish projects, and generally being the kind of person everyone likes to have around. Jake was polite, hardworking, and quick to learn. Even the grumpiest people in the office warmed up to him, which is saying a lot. I work in the operations team, and while we didn't work directly together, I'd run into Jake during meetings or in the break room. He'd always greet me with a smile and ask how my day was going. It felt genuine too, not like the forced politeness you usually get in an office. For the first few weeks, everything seemed fine. Jake fit in well, and things were business as usual. But looking back, I realized there were small signs that something wasn't quite right. At the time, I didn't think much of it. For instance, Jake would occasionally zone out during conversations, staring off into space like he wasn't really there. It wasn't often enough to be concerning, just something I noticed in passing. Another thing was that he never talked about his personal life. Most of us would chat about our weekends or mention family stuff during lunch, but Jake kept to himself. I figured he was just shy or private, and honestly, I respected that. But now I wonder if there was more to it. The real change started about 3 weeks ago. It was a Monday morning, and Jake came into the office looking like he hadn't slept all weekend. His eyes were bloodshot, his hair was messy, and he had this weird, jittery energy about him. He was still polite, but his usual cheerful attitude seemed forced. I joked with him about having a wild weekend, and he just laughed nervously and said something like that. As the week went on, his behavior became more erratic. He'd snap at people over small things, like someone taking too long at the coffee machine. During meetings, he'd get unusually defensive if someone questioned his ideas. It was like he was on edge all the time, and it put everyone else on edge too. By Friday, it was clear that something was seriously wrong. Jake got into a shouting match with one of the managers over a minor scheduling issue. It was completely out of character for him, and everyone in the office was shocked. Afterward, he stormed out of the building and didn't come back for the rest of the day. Over the weekend, I couldn't stop thinking about Jake. He'd gone from being the model employee to someone who seemed dangerous. I figured he was going through something personal, like a breakup or family trouble, and hoped he'd come back on Monday feeling more like himself. But I was wrong, so wrong. When Jake showed up the next week, he was even worse. His eyes had this wild, almost paranoid look, and he kept glancing over his shoulder like he thought someone was following him. He wasn't just snapping at people anymore. He was outright aggressive. He'd slam his desk drawers shut, mutter under his breath, and glare at anyone who got too close. The vibe in the office completely shifted. People stopped chatting in the break room, and meetings were tense and uncomfortable. By now, everyone was talking about Jake behind his back. There were rumors that he was having a mental breakdown or that he'd started drinking heavily. No one knew what to do, and management didn't seem to want to get involved. They probably hoped it would blow over on its own. I wish they'd done something sooner. Things came to a head late one night when I stayed late to finish some reports. The office was nearly empty, with just a few people left in the building. I was in my cubicle, typing away, when I heard a loud crash from the break room. My heart jumped, and I froze for a second, trying to figure out what had happened. Then I heard a voice, Jake's voice, muttering something I couldn't make out. I got up and walked toward the break room, my footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. When I turned the corner, I saw Jake standing by the counter, breathing heavily. His face was pale, and his hands were trembling. On the floor was a shattered coffee pot, pieces of glass scattered everywhere. "Jake," I said cautiously, "are you okay?" He whipped around to face me, his eyes wide and wild. For a moment, he didn't say anything, just stared at me like he didn't recognize me. Then he muttered, "It's not okay. Nothing's okay." Before I could respond, he pushed past me and stormed out of the room, disappearing down the hallway. I stood there for a long time, staring at the broken glass. Something about the way he looked at me sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't just anger or frustration. It was something darker, something I couldn't quite put into words. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jake's face, those wild, unseeing eyes. I didn't know what was going on with him, but I had a feeling that whatever it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was going to happen. Jake's behavior was becoming impossible to ignore, and it was starting to affect everyone in the office. Even the most laid-back people were on edge, jumping at small noises or avoiding Jake altogether. It was like his mood was contagious, turning our normally easygoing workplace into a pressure cooker. The following day, I came into work early. I thought maybe if I got ahead on my tasks, I wouldn't have to stay late again, and I could avoid any more creepy encounters. When I arrived, the office was mostly empty except for the cleaning crew and a couple of early risers. It was quiet, too quiet, honestly. I made my way to my desk and started booting up my computer when I noticed something strange. Jake's cubicle was a mess. Papers were scattered all over his desk, and his chair was knocked over. A coffee cup sat on its side, dripping cold liquid onto the floor. Jake wasn't there, but it looked like he'd left in a hurry. For a second, I considered calling someone, but I figured maybe he just had another outburst and stormed off before I arrived. Still, something about the scene didn't sit right with me. As the morning went on, Jake finally showed up. He looked even worse than he had the day before. His hair was unkempt, his clothes wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes. He didn't say hello to anyone. He just shuffled to his desk and sat down, staring blankly at his computer screen. He stayed like that for hours, barely moving, except for the occasional twitch or glance over his shoulder. Around lunchtime, I decided to talk to one of my coworkers, Lisa. She worked in HR and was always the person people went to when they had a problem. If anyone could figure out what to do about Jake, it was her. "Hey, can I talk to you for a second?" I asked, pulling her aside in the break room. "Sure," she said, giving me a concerned look. "What's up?" "It's about Jake," I said, lowering my voice. "Have you noticed how off he's been lately?" She sighed and nodded. "Yeah, everyone has. We're all worried, but honestly, I don't know what to do. He's not breaking any rules, technically, and management doesn't want to intervene unless he does. They keep saying it's not our business." "Well, it's becoming everyone's business," I said, frustrated. "He's scaring people. Yesterday, he smashed a coffee pot, and last week he screamed at Mark in the middle of the office." Lisa frowned. "I didn't know about the coffee pot. That's not good. Maybe I should talk to him, see if he'll open up. He might just need someone to listen." "Be careful," I warned. "There's something off about him. I can't explain it, but I don't think he's in his right mind." Lisa promised to handle it, and I went back to my desk, feeling slightly relieved. At least someone was taking this seriously. But as the day went on, things got even stranger. Around 3 p.m., I heard Jake arguing with someone on the phone. His voice was loud and agitated, and even though I couldn't make out what he was saying, the tone was enough to make my skin crawl. A few other people noticed too, glancing uneasily in his direction. After a few minutes, he slammed the phone down so hard that everyone jumped. Then, without saying a word, he grabbed his jacket and stormed out of the building. The rest of the day was tense. People whispered about Jake in hushed tones, speculating about what was going on with him. Some thought he was having personal issues, while others joked that he was losing it. I didn't find it funny. Something about the whole situation felt wrong, like we were all ignoring the warning signs of something much bigger. That evening, as I was packing up to leave, I overheard Lisa talking to one of the managers. "I tried to talk to him," she said quietly, "but he just brushed me off. He said everything was fine and told me to mind my own business." "Well, if he says he's fine, there's not much we can do," the manager replied. "Unless he threatens someone or causes actual harm, our hands are tied." Lisa didn't look convinced, and neither was I. But I didn't say anything. I just grabbed my bag and headed out, hoping that tomorrow would be better. It wasn't. The next day, Jake didn't show up to work. At first, people were relieved. His absence made the office feel less tense. But as the hours went by, the relief turned to unease. Someone mentioned that they'd seen him pacing in the parking lot early that morning, talking to himself. Another person said they'd heard strange noises coming from his cubicle after hours, like someone was rifling through drawers or muttering under their breath. By lunchtime, rumors were flying. Some people thought Jake had quit or been fired, while others speculated that he'd had a breakdown and been taken to the hospital. No one knew for sure, and management wasn't saying anything. Then, just as things were starting to settle down, Jake came back. It was late in the afternoon, and most of us were at our desks, trying to wrap up for the day. The sound of the door opening made everyone look up, and there he was, standing in the doorway. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot, and there was something in his expression that made my stomach twist. He didn't look angry or upset. He looked haunted. Without saying a word, he walked to his desk, sat down, and started typing furiously. No one dared approach him. The entire office was silent, the air thick with tension. I tried to focus on my work, but I couldn't stop glancing at Jake. His movements were jerky and erratic, like he was barely in control of his own body. At one point, he stopped typing and just sat there, staring at the screen with a blank, empty expression. It was like he wasn't even there. As the clock inched toward 5 p.m., I decided to leave early. I couldn't stand the atmosphere anymore. It felt like the walls were closing in. As I grabbed my things and headed for the door, I glanced back at Jake one last time. He was staring at me. Not at my desk, not at the door, at me. His eyes were locked onto mine, unblinking and intense. It felt like he was trying to tell me something, but I didn't know what. I quickly looked away and hurried out of the building, my heart pounding in my chest. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about that look. It wasn't anger or malice. It was something else. Fear, maybe? Or desperation. Whatever it was, I knew one thing for sure. Jake was in trouble, and whatever was going on with him, it wasn't over yet. The next couple of days were tense, but relatively uneventful, until Friday night. That's when everything started spiraling out of control. I had stayed late again, not because I wanted to, but because of a looming deadline. Most of the office was empty by 7 p.m., with only a couple of lights still on and the faint hum of the AC breaking the silence. The atmosphere was eerie, but I was too focused on my work to let it bother me. I told myself I'd finish up and get out of there as quickly as possible. Around 8 p.m., I heard the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was just a cleaning crew, but the steps were uneven, almost dragging. They seemed to pause for a moment before continuing down the hallway. My heart rate picked up. "Hello?" I called out, trying to sound casual. No response. I peeked over the wall of my cubicle, but the corridor was empty. Shaking my head, I told myself I was just being paranoid. I went back to my computer, trying to push the noise out of my mind. A few minutes later, the footsteps came again. This time, they were slower, more deliberate, and they seemed to stop right outside my cubicle. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Is someone there?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. Still nothing. I stood up cautiously and looked around. That's when I saw him, Jake, standing at the far end of the hallway, partially hidden in the shadows. His head was tilted slightly, and he was staring directly at me. Even from a distance, I could see how disheveled he looked. His shirt was untucked, his hair was a mess, and his eyes had that same wild, haunted look I'd seen before. "Jake," I said hesitantly, "what are you doing here?" He didn't answer. Instead, he took a step toward me, his movements slow and deliberate. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something wasn't right. "I think you should go home," I said, trying to sound calm. "It's late, and you—" Before I could finish, he suddenly lunged forward, closing the distance between us in a matter of seconds. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, as he stopped just a few feet away from me. Up close, I could see that his face was pale and sweaty, and his pupils were dilated. He looked unhinged. "You don't understand," he said, his voice low and frantic. "They're watching. They're always watching." "What are you talking about?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "They know everything," he whispered, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "I can't trust anyone. Not you, not them. No one." I took a cautious step back, my hands raised in a placating gesture. "Jake, you're scaring me. Please, let's just sit down and talk. I can help you." His eyes snapped back to mine, and for a moment I thought he was going to attack me. But then he backed away, shaking his head violently. No, you can't help me," he muttered. No one can. With that, he turned and ran down the hallway, disappearing into the shadows. I stood there, trembling, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to call someone, security, the police, anyone, but I was also afraid of making things worse. What if he came back? I decided to leave. My work could wait. Grabbing my bag, I hurried out of the office, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The parking lot was eerily quiet, and every shadow felt like a potential threat. I didn't relax until I was in my car with the doors locked. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, trying to make sense of Jake's behavior. What did he mean by "they're watching"? Was he hallucinating? Paranoid? On drugs? None of it made sense. The next morning, I got a call from Lisa. She sounded shaken. "Have you heard about what happened?" she asked. "No, what's going on?" I said, my stomach dropping. "It's Jake. He attacked someone last night. Mark from accounting." My blood ran cold. "What? Is Mark okay?" "He's in the hospital," she said. Jake cornered him in the parking lot and started yelling about how Mark was part of some conspiracy. When Mark tried to walk away, Jake snapped and hit him with a metal pipe. Security managed to stop him before things got worse, but it's bad. I felt sick. I thought about calling Jake the night before, trying to get him help before something like this happened. But I hadn't. I'd done nothing. "Where's Jake now?" I asked. "The police took him into custody," Lisa said. "They're saying he might have been on drugs, but they're still investigating." I wanted to believe that was the end of it, that Jake was out of the picture and we could all move on. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. There was something about the way he'd looked at me in the hallway, something that made me feel like this wasn't just a random act of violence. It felt personal, and I was right. Later that night, I got a call from an unknown number. When I answered, there was no one on the other end, just heavy breathing. I hung up, my heart pounding, and tried to convince myself it was a wrong number. But then it happened again, and again. Each time, I could hear faint whispers in the background, like someone was trying to speak but couldn't quite form the words. By the fourth call, I was too scared to answer. The next morning, I found a note slipped under my apartment door. It was written on a crumpled piece of paper in shaky handwriting, and it said just one thing: "You're not safe either." I stood there, staring at the note, my hands trembling. My mind raced with possibilities. Had Jake somehow escaped? Was he coming after me now? Or was this someone else entirely? One thing was clear: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The note under my door shook me to my core. I didn't know who had left it, but every instinct told me it was connected to Jake. The words, "You're not safe either," played over and over in my head as I tried to piece everything together. I considered calling the police, but what would I even say? That I got a creepy note, and I think it might be related to my unstable coworker? It felt flimsy, but I kept the note just in case. Work on Monday was tense. Jake's attack on Mark had become the main topic of conversation, and no one felt comfortable being in the office. Management was holding mandatory meetings to reassure us that security measures were being increased, but it was hard to feel safe knowing what had happened, and knowing that Jake had escaped police custody for a brief period before being recaptured. That part haunted me. Apparently, he'd broken free while being transported to a holding facility. The news didn't explain how it happened, only that he'd been caught a few hours later in the woods behind his apartment complex, completely out of his mind. It was during those hours he'd escaped that I'd started receiving the calls, and the note had appeared. It couldn't be a coincidence. But if Jake had been captured, how could he still be reaching me? The thought stuck with me all day, making it impossible to focus. Around 5 p.m., most of my coworkers had already left for the day, and I was packing up to leave when Lisa approached me. She looked pale and shaken, like she hadn't slept in days. "I need to show you something," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure we were alone. "What is it?" I asked, uneasy. "Not here," she said. "Let's go to my car." Reluctantly, I followed her. In the parking lot, she unlocked her car and handed me her phone. "This was on Mark's desk this morning," she said. I looked at the screen. It was a photo of a crumpled piece of paper, similar to the one I'd found under my door. The handwriting was the same, shaky, uneven, but the message was different. "I know what you saw." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What does this mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Lisa shook her head. "I don't know, But Mark's not awake to tell us anything. And there's more. She swiped to another photo. This one was a document, something from an old HR file. The name at the top jumped out at me immediately. Jake Peterson. Below were notes about his hiring process, references, and background checks. One part was highlighted in yellow. Former employer. Terminated due to violent incident with coworker. Reason undisclosed. What the hell? I muttered. Why would they hire him if they knew this? Lisa sighed, running a hand through her hair. I asked the same thing. Turns out, Jake's file was incomplete when they hired him. He claimed his previous employer didn't have documentation on him because the company went under. The background check didn't flag anything. But now, looking deeper, this came up. My stomach churned. So he's done something like this before? It looks that way, Lisa said. And if he left that note on Mark's desk? Her voice trailed off, but we both knew what she was implying. Jake might not have been working alone. Someone could be helping him, or worse, enabling him. Lisa, I said, my voice shaky. I got a note too. Her eyes widened. What? When? Over the weekend. And the handwriting, it's the same. I told her about the phone calls and the note under my door. She looked horrified. You need to report this, she said. The police. Before she could finish, my phone buzzed. I pulled it out of my pocket and froze when I saw the number. Unknown caller. My stomach dropped. Lisa looked at me. Answer it. I hesitated but finally pressed the button and held the phone to my ear. Hello. For a moment, there was nothing but static. Then a voice came through, distorted and low, like it was being played through a broken speaker. You saw it. You know the truth. My heart felt like it stopped. Who is this? I demanded, my voice trembling. The line went dead. I looked at Lisa, my hand shaking. What the hell does that mean? I saw what? Before she could respond, the parking lot lights flickered, plunging us into darkness for a few agonizing seconds. When they came back on, Lisa and I instinctively looked around, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Everything was still. Too still. We need to get out of here, Lisa said, her voice urgent. I didn't argue. We both got into our cars and left, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us. That voice on the phone, it wasn't just a threat. It was a warning, and it meant that whatever Jake had been dealing with wasn't over. That night, I replayed everything in my head. The notes, the calls, the look Jake had given me in the hallway. And then it hit me, something I'd forgotten, something small but crucial. A month ago, before all of this started, I'd stayed late one night. Jake had been there too, working on some project. As I was leaving, I glanced into his cubicle and noticed a document on his screen. I hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now I remembered what it said. It was a list of names. My name was on it. So was Mark's. And Lisa's. I didn't know what the list was for, but one thing was clear. Whatever was happening, it wasn't random. We were being targeted, and Jake had been keeping track all along. The realization hit me like a freight train. Jake had been planning something all along. That list, it wasn't just names. It was a deliberate, organized record. But of what? Targets? Witnesses? People he thought were part of whatever conspiracy he'd ranted about? My heart pounded as I tried to connect the dots, but the truth still felt just out of reach. The next morning, I decided to share what I knew. I showed Lisa the list I'd scribbled down from memory and told her about seeing it on Jake's screen that night. She looked just as unnerved as I felt. We have to go to the police, she said firmly. If we don't, someone else could get hurt. I nodded, though I wasn't sure how much they'd believe. Still, the idea of doing nothing was unbearable. That afternoon, we went to the station, laid everything out for a detective, Jake's behavior, the attack on Mark, the notes, the calls, and the list. The detective, a tall man with a grizzled face, listened carefully, taking notes. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and let out a sigh. There's something you don't know, he said, his tone grim. After Jake's escape, we searched his apartment. It was unsettling. What do you mean? Lisa asked. He pulled out a folder and placed a photo on the table. It was a small, cramped room, cluttered with papers, notebooks, and photos pinned to the walls. The photos were of us, me, Lisa, Mark, and others from the office. Some were recent, taken without our knowledge. Each one was marked with red ink. Names, dates, and cryptic notes like "watch closer" or "can't be trusted." This was a stalking case, the detective said. Jake was spiraling. It looks like he believed you were all part of some scheme against him. I felt sick. But why? We didn't do anything. The detective shook his head. It's hard to say. Drug use can cause paranoia, but this was something deeper. We think he was fixated on someone in the office. The pattern suggests he believed one of you was controlling the others. Controlling us? Lisa repeated, her voice shaky. The detective nodded. In his mind, you were part of a larger conspiracy. But here's the part that's more concerning. The notes indicate he wasn't working alone. Lisa and I exchanged a horrified look. What do you mean? I asked. We found evidence of communication with someone else, he said. Another person feeding his delusions. We're still investigating who that might be. A cold dread washed over me. Someone else? My mind immediately went to the calls, the note under my door. Jake was in custody now, but that meant the person who had been reaching out to me wasn't him. Someone else was still out there. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of my apartment felt like a threat. I kept my phone close, jumping every time it buzzed, but the calls had stopped. For now. The next day at work, the atmosphere was oppressive. Everyone seemed to be on edge, glancing nervously at the doors and windows. Management announced they were hiring private security, but it felt like too little, too late. Mark was still in the hospital, and Jake's arrest hadn't brought the closure we'd hoped for. If anything, it raised more questions. Late that evening, I stayed behind to help Lisa pack up her things. She decided to take a leave of absence. Something about getting out of town for a while to clear her head. I envied her ability to walk away. As we locked up, I heard footsteps echoing down the hallway, the same uneven, dragging steps that had haunted me before. Did you hear that? I whispered. Lisa froze, her face pale. Let's go, she said, gripping my arm. We hurried toward the exit, but the sound followed us, growing louder. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see Jake, even though I knew it couldn't be him. Instead, the corridor was empty. But there was something on the floor, something small and white. A note. Lisa stopped short as I bent to pick it up. The handwriting was the same as before, shaky and uneven, and the message sent a chill straight through me. It's not over. We ran. Neither of us stopped until we were in our cars, doors locked, hearts racing. Lisa rolled down her window just enough to speak. What do we do now? I didn't have an answer. All I could do was stare at the note. The words burned into my mind. Jake was behind bars, but the terror he'd created wasn't. Whoever had been working with him, or manipulating him, was still out there. And they weren't done with us yet. In the weeks that followed, things slowly returned to some semblance of normalcy. Mark recovered, Lisa left town, and the office implemented new security protocols. But for me, normalcy was an illusion. Every time my phone rang or I heard footsteps behind me, my heart would race. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching, waiting. The list haunted me most of all. My name had been on it, circled in red, with a single word written beside it, key. I still don't know what that means. And I'm not sure I want to find out.